The Sea of Chaos. Victor stared off at the endless sea as he leaned on his ship's railings. The constant of waves crashing underneath the hulls and splashing his raven hair while the smell of salt hanging in the air was an acquired taste for many on their first voyage. But for him, he was born in such an environment. And since he lived the life of a corsair like his fathers and his fathers' fathers before him, the career was both a fitting and profitable experience. Especially for an ambitious drachii looking to sail his own black ark. However, his ship, a galleon outfitted with Reaper ballistian cannons and not repurposed for piracy that he willingly taken off from the Britannians, was serviceable enough. The crew were carrying their duties, making sure the ship was taking its course to Araby. All while attempting to avoid the shores of Alcuin. Emphasis on attempt as he was still indecisive on whether or not to plunder a port just for the hell of it. I might as well let the boys have their fun, he told himself. Besides them, there were the slaves who did their chores thoroughly. One slave made the mistake of spilled a bottle of excellent wine onto the lower decks and was strapped to the front of the ship to be keel-hauled to death the other day. This ensured the others to stay in line lest they be made an example like the poor soul. He took a bite of his apple, a rare treat as far as corsair raids have provided, and walked back to the main deck. Plenty of activity going on the ship. He passed by a dwarfen slave scrubbing the floors and a couple of the shipmates pulling and rigging on the masts. His first mate greeted him. "Captain Sindric, how is our crew? Is our course scheduled as planned?" Victor asked, cheerfully. His first mate politely smiled and answered. "Crew is fine, Captain. We have plenty of supplies and we will be near Alcuin in the dead of night. The boys have been relieving themselves with the maiden in the lower decks. Although, they're asking if we could get more women once we arrive in Araby. They've grown tired of sharing. Plus, they're getting a little tensed up, especially knowing that we'll be heading near Alcuin territory. We won't get there until tonight if our navigator has told us otherwise." Victor raised an eyebrow at the seeming demands given by them. Do they realize who they're speaking to?" Victor reminded, sternly. Cedric remained silent but looked visibly uncomfortable to answer. Well, Captain, they may have been simple. I'm jesting," Victor joked, donning a smile to ease his first mate's reaction. "I am a charitable man to my crew. They grow restless and it's about time we start lighting up the place for once." Victor looked to the rest of the ship and began a speech. "Attention," he announced, stopping his crew from their duties, temporarily. "Crew, I have received your complaints. And they are most well received. We are headed close to our most hated cousin. I have given some time to think and I have decided that we will raid a town. We will plunder their riches and slaughter them like cattle in the name of Cain. Tonight, we will make the drachii back home proud. And I promise that we will get the greatest pleasures Araby can provide. For I, Victor of House Bloodsong, captain of the fated Silence, rewards all." The crew cheered with malicious glee and hollered for the blood of the Aesir. Victor smirked at their praises, but no less appreciative of their dedication. "Now get back to work. Lest you desire all of us to sleep with the sirens of the sea," Victor finished, with the crew laughing before going back to their business. Might, Victor," an alluring voice struck out. "You do know how to spoil them." Walking in from the shadows, strode a sorceress. Beautiful to the eye of the beholder, but cold as the breath of Nagaroth. Her pale complexion was exposed save for the metal brought in soft black fabrics that barely covered her sultry figure. She had taken his breath since they were born under the same night and shared their crib, and then the bed as they grew older. His crew eyed her with carnal lust but knew better than to approach her. More so knowing that it was Ciressa, the twin sister of Victor Bloodsong, and they steered clear of her for that reason alone. Anyone who had the misfortune of even so much as speak to her ran afoul of her brother. They were lucky that he allowed them to gaze upon her. Otherwise, they'd be dropping like flies in just a few minutes. "Well, it is time that I throw a bone for them, Ciressa." "Wouldn't want any displeasure from a mutiny," he replied. Ciressa smiled and closed on him with a passionate kiss, before biting on his bottom lip with vigor. "Then, start spoiling me as well," she teased, before grabbing his crotch suggestively. Victor grabbed her ass in response with a tight squeeze, while Cindric waited by uncomfortably as he watched the siblings grope each other in public. This took about a couple of minutes before Victor stopped midway and realized something. "Oh, I just realized that I needed to do something," he exclaimed, much to Ceresa's displeasure and annoyance. Victor looked back to Cindric, who patiently waited for his captain's orders. "I'll be below the decks to announce the maiden's early retirement." "As you will it," Captain Cindric replied, amicably. Victor then set his attention to his sister, who began pouting. "Why are you giving that whore so much attention now? She is beneath you." "Indeed. But I do honor my words to the letter if I can help it, dearest sister," Victor replied. Ceresa rolled her eyes, before leaning in his ear. "I'll be in the captain's quarters," she whispered, before looking fondly at his ear. The captain felt hard again, but needed to get his priorities done quickly. He departed and headed below the decks. Several crew members and slaves moved aside to give him room, allowing him to maneuver through the tight corridors. He entered the lower decks, waving to a couple of his crew members before standing in front of the door where a guardsman stood up from his seat and closed a book on the table. "Captain." Terran Victor greeted. "How's the maiden?" "She's gone quiet. Boys might have roughed her up a bit," Terran answered. "I think they might have broken her." "Tisk, tisk. That's no good," Victor said with dismay. "Then how am I supposed to keep the boys settled when they have no toy left to play?" Victor frowned. "Let me in." "Right away, sir." The guardsman opened the door to the maiden's chamber. Stepping in, Victor entered and found himself in nothing more than a filthy room full of dried blood and waste. Sitting around the corner was the maiden. A Britannian woman. Once, she had fine ruby hair contrasting her porcelain skin and jade-colored eyes, with the body of a queen lowered only beneath the hag sorceress herself. Her breasts were plump and hips made for childbearing. It was like holding a prized swine with her around. Now, she laid on the floor like a shriveling corpse. Gaunt and suffering from malnutrition, the past 4 months had not been kind to her. The amount of drugs injected into her and her diet being nothing but scraps and leftovers, along with bodily fluids, was a testament that she could survive this long. She was in a cradling position by the time he stood over. Her back was exposed with several cuts and lashes and plenty of bite marks around her skin. He saw a couple of fingernails planted deep within the board and couple of teeth loose on the floor. She remained still, almost as if dead. However, a small nudge from his boot was all it took for her to faintly flinch upon reaction. Victor smiled in relief. "Ah, good, you're alive," he said. "I'm so glad to tell you that your service is no longer needed once we arrived in Araby. From there, you'll be dropped off and hopefully sold off for a small sum. I hope my crew hadn't been too rough with you. You know how they are, always in need of relieving themselves somehow. But I assure you that this will be all over once we get to the continent." He kneeled down and leaned closer to her. "Oh, don't be so dour. You've made it this far. Perhaps you'll find a new husband in a sultan," he reassured, as he gently moved the hairs away to see a glimpse of her face. About as dead as a doornail if her expression was to go by. This, however, did not dissuade him from being a gentleman. "Speaking of husbands, it seems your former betrothed has finally decided to accompany you after all." Victor took a glance back to one corner of the room. Sitting in the other corner, was the pickled head of a dearly beloved in a jar. One eye remained open as if to watch over her. He sneered at the practical joke he invented for his and everyone's amusement. He stood up, patting his legs from whatever dust was clinging onto him, and made his farewells. "Well then, that's all I have to say to you. It was certainly a pleasure to have you on board." Knocking on the door again, the guard opened and Victor soon exited the room. After he had finally left, tears flowed out of the maiden's eyes. Lothern, Alpuin. Alariel studied Doomslayer's behavior as he sat across her. For a man of his stature, he was surprising calm and well-mannered. She would have thought him to be a bit more menacing around others. Granted, he was already with his eccentric appearance alone, especially since the funeral. But other than that, he seemed oddly curious. Curious about the life around him. From the noise of the denizens of Lothern to the unusual contraptions brought about from the Empire to the festivities surrounding the market. A sense of wonder, it seems. Likewise, onlookers stared wide-eyed at the Everqueen's entourage as they passed by several streets. More specifically, Doomslayer with the Everqueen's entourage. To be frank, he stood out like an eyesore. His admittedly earthly but darker colored armor stood in contrast to the bright colors of both the handmaidens and her own clothing. And that's not to mention how towering he was compared to the rest of her guard. And those eyes. She had seen that kind of stare from plenty of her kin that served on the line of duty. Loss, anger, pain. She had even seen it in Tyrion and Iltharion as well. The latter especially when he had returned from one of his campaign against the Greenskins. She wondered what went inside the Slayer's mind. However, his polite demeanor and fast friendship with her daughter ultimately won her appeal. In the present, they sat in the gardens somewhere in the upper levels of the city. From there, a great view of the port greeted them. They were on a patio secluded from the rest of the public's eye. Alarielle and her daughter sat on one side of the table while Doomslayer sat opposite of them. While it was admittedly just to get know her guest further, her true intentions were to understand the anomaly surrounding him. His presence was no coincidence when she felt the strange surge of magic eclipsed her mind, last night. The nature around her rejuvenated her domain with renewed life, unexpectedly. And now the answers she had been searching for were sitting in right front of her. She had to thank Teclis for bringing a blessing to the world. If I may interrupt your thoughts, Everqueen, the voice known as Samuel Hayden started. But is there something on your mind that you would like to ask of us? You left us hanging in silence for a moment. The question brought her back to reality and she now realized that she'd been staring at the Slayer for an uncomfortably long time. Eleuthera was sitting next to her with her Althena on her lap and she too felt awkward about her mother's. She quickly shakied her head off and composed herself. Oh right. Excuse me, she excused. Much apologies. I'm still getting used to the appearance of your companion's armor. Very unusual, yet unique even by either human or dwarfen standards. Such remarkable designs. Forgive my starry eyes. Doomslayer shrugged. None taken, he says, Hayden added. Alarielle peeked an eyebrow a bit. Do you speak for him, Dr. Hayden? She asked. I do, in fact, Hayden answered. Ages have passed since he had lost his voice. It was before my time, so you'll have to excuse the occasional silent treatment and sign language. I have to roughly interpret his words in a way for you and others to understand. That's terrible, Eleuthera exclaimed. I would have liked to know what your voice sounds like. Must be hard to be understood by a lot of people. Eleuthera, Alarielle admonished. That's no way to treat our guest. Sorry, Mother, Eleuthera apologized. This only emitted a faint laughter from the doctor. Heh, there's no need to. He isn't exactly the most approachable person as I have known, firsthand. Most people usually stay a distance away from him. Of course, he's far more interested in being on the battlefield than standing idle and chatter while listening on to a bunch of nobles bicker for hours about minuscule politics. Alarielle was briefly taken aback by the bold words flowing out of the unseen doctor, but smirked in agreement. I can certainly agree with such a statement, even if it is a bit blasphemous to speak in front of the Everqueen, Doctor. Apologies. Much of my impressions of the princes were low. No need. I, too, do dislike the politics within the Phoenix Court. Fortunately, such things are beneath the duties of an Everqueen. Interesting. Care to explain what duties an Everqueen upholds? Gladly, Alarielle said. An Everqueen, first and foremost, represents Isha, the goddess of life and protector of the natural order. It is a high position not unlike a Phoenix King. One of importance, but that's where the similarities ends, really. Unlike the Phoenix King, the position of an Everqueen is hereditary rather than voted among the court. So naturally, my daughter Eleuthera would be the next Everqueen. Curious way of changing representatives. One side done democratically, the other passed down by blood. One focused on political order, the other, the natural order. A strange union, if there ever was one. Such a remark brought amusement to Alarielle. Mike, you're awfully curious of the world's surroundings. I'm a researcher, Hayden replied. My goal is to find any resources that could be of beneficial use. Right now, my world has dried up its own natural resources, and are currently in the stages of what could be considered a famine, if you will. Alarielle's smile quickly turned into frown immediately. Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I nearly forgot you come from a desperate world. Forgive my manners. None taken. What I've gathered might yield plenty of excellent results, and Teclis has mentioned other scientific minds who are willing to trade such vital intel. Mages, I've been told. Yes, you are correct, Alarielle said. Although, I am more than willing to help as well. I am a chosen of Isha, and as such, my abilities could heal the old wounds of your world. I would be glad of your assistance then, Everqueen, Hayden said, appreciatively. Please, call me Alarielle. There's no need for such formalities. If you insist. Alarielle perked up appreciatively with Hayden's quick acceptance. Discussion was soon interrupted when Aeleuthra's pet rabbit jumped off from her lap and hopped over to Doomslayer's. Aeleuthra attempted to stop but turned silent as she saw him cradle her in his arm and stroke her fur softly and caringly in a manner that would be seen in many rabbit handlers. Alarielle too was alarmed by this as well. Yet, both were pleased and touched by the tender display. Oh, I had not known the Slayer to display such affection for such wondrous creatures, Alarielle remarked, watching Althena rest on Doomslayer's arm. Aeleuthra watched in awe of the display. He used to have a pet rabbit at one point. Daisy, her name was, Hayden explained. Oh, what happened to her? Alarielle asked. She died. Alarielle and her daughter drooped their ears in dismay of hearing his pet's death. The Everqueen didn't want to ask further as it was more likely sensitive to the Doomslayer. I'm sorry to hear that, Alarielle said. Doomslayer responded with a nod in appreciation. He returned Althena back to Aeleuthra, carefully giving her into the Everchild's arms. Hayden soon spoke in the midst of it. Alarielle, with all due respect, we are very much honored to be in your presence, but it seems there is something important that you would like to discuss. Alarielle acted confused, but was well aware, and played up the ignorance a bit. Are we already not discussing the importance of your stay here? Maybe, but this story isn't about my research. It's about him, really. Alarielle said nothing, but her smile changed to a flat but neutral position. Aeleuthra, would give us a moment to ourselves? I'll have the handmaidens watch over you. Yes, mother. Aeleuthra stood up from her seat and left to walk about. Alarielle gestured some of her handmaidens to follow the Everchild, to which they complied. After they left, it was only Alarielle, Hayden, and Doomslayer alone. Alarielle took a deep breath and prepared herself. Your presence, Doomslayer, has shifted the balance in the winds of magic. I brought you here for that reason alone. Why am I not surprised? Hayden remarked. Alarielle shook her head in dismissal. Please, Dr. Hayden. What I'm speaking about is certainly one of importance. And I meant no offense, Everqueen, Hayden replied. But continue. Alarielle continued on where she left off. His arrival is an omen. The princes scoffed at you as if you were the lore master's new experiment, but I know you for what you are. I do not know how Teclis brought you here, nor do I need to know as to why you are here. But what you bring could change the very fate of this world. Alarielle leaned in closer. When I first saw you walking down the funeral, I saw death close to you. The rage inside of you was palpable. Destruction and vengeance follow you like hounds to a master. I can see them in your eyes, so much pain behind them. The Everqueen saw his eyes study her. She was not entirely sure if her words carried weight, but it would seem like he was contemplating her sympathies. His eyes closed and she could faintly hear him exhaling a sharp breath beneath his helm. It is not the first time he has received this kind of attention, nor it will be the last, Hayden answered. I understand. Alarielle placed a hand over the table and gestured him to give his. If I may, Alarielle said. Doomslayer stared at her hand for a few minutes, and slowly, if hesitantly, raised it over. At a moment's touch, darkness enveloped her mind. And what came after was horror. Premonitions of twisted monstrosities flooded her vision. They were not unlike the daemons of chaos, ravenous creatures fighting for power and ravaging millions of worlds to sate their hunger. But they were in unison, undivided. Legions upon legions of hellish creatures united under a dark ruler. Each were distinct from one another yet reveled in the carnage they wrought. Small, wiry creatures snarled and clawed at whatever unfortunate soul met them, hulking beasts with skulls for heads crushed and trampled upon the weak as they lay siege upon worlds. Undead abominations in constant agony throw fire with strange protrusions on their backs. While even larger and fiercer monsters with red skin and horns roared and destroyed all that stood in their way with sickly green fire and claw. And yet they were only a fraction of what comprised their army. The greatest of them all, however, stood taller than even the tallest monument built by any race. Its very nature symbolized the greatest evils that these demons worshipped. All of creation was in peril. More so than even chaos could ever accomplish. Yet, one stood alone against the endless hordes of evil. For they feared him the most. He saw two worlds ravaged like countless others. His loved ones, his brothers in arms, his people, his home, gone. The last shred of his sanity left on the first world. Only rage followed, and it was suffocating him. The loss was too much, and the Slayer drowned in his anger for a long time, until he found a new home. The second world rebuilt him as a far stronger and more resilient man. His sanity returned and he had found brotherhood in this new home. He forged bonds with the greatest warriors, knighted by a king and fought side by side with them against the evils that returned. And in time, was blessed by heavenly beings into something more divine. He was the champion, protector and destroyer. The shield and defense of the innocent and sword to plunge the wicked. For he walked alone as the light in the eternal darkness. It was only through the machinations of treachery and corruption did the cycle start anew. And when his second world had fallen, he did not fall into despair. Neither anguish nor struggle overcome him. No longer was he drowning in the anger that festered unto him for so long. In the formless sea of violence, where others drowned in bloodshed and war, he remained undeterred. And thrived in the vast ocean of blood. He was calm before the storm, and rose above the surface. For only one could face the coming tide. And it was the very man who sat across her. The vision soon stopped, and by the time Alarielle was able to make sense of her surroundings, she was on the ground with tear stains formed on her cheeks and blood pouring out of her nose. Her breathing became heavy and frantic while her body trembled uncontrollably. By now, Doomslayer and her handmaidens had surrounded her with worry and fear, with the latter looking directly at the former with no hesitation to kill him. Eleuthera returned as well, with great worry and confusion in her expressions. Alarielle, a voice called out. It was her beloved Tyrion, and behind him was Teclis. He rushed to her side with fear in his eyes. Are you all right? Tyrion asked, before looking back at Doomslayer with blind anger. What did you to her? Answer me, damn you, he lashed out. The Slayer did not speak, but his eyes turned to that of a death stare, which did not break Tyrion's resolve as he met his gaze with renewed anger. Thankfully, it was Hayden who had answered. We had done nothing. She tried to see through his mind. Whatever she saw must have taken her by surprise. I could only fathom what she had seen. There are things even you don't know in your long lifespan. Tyrion was about ready to retaliate and unleash his sword, only for his brother to stand in the way. Stop it, Tyrion, Teclis demanded. What Hayden speaks may be the truth. Tyrion was incensed by his brother's continued defense for the Slayer. Again and again, you continue to defend him whenever you have the chance even as the problems are there before you. Why must you turn your back on our people when he's done nothing but bring disaster since you summoned him? Because he's the last hope we have at stopping chaos, Teclis replied. The wider world is at stake and he is our salvation. Both brothers stared down at one another. For a moment, it seemed like the bonds between them would break. But Teclis kept to his senses and became the voice of reason. We can't defend just Altuin any longer, brother. The end times are upon us and we cannot survive this war unless we ally with the Empire, the dwarfs, and even the lizardmen. We cannot ignore the few options that we have left, and I intend to make sure that this world sees another light of day. With or without your help. Tyrion struggled to comprehend his brother's reasoning. His patience for him was running thin and it was the last straw. Alarielle, however, came back to her senses and stood back up with the aid of a handmaiden by her side. Tyrion, please, she pleaded. What Hayden speaks of is true. I took his hand and saw through his mind on my own. And what I saw is something that you cannot imagine. Alarielle looked back at Doomslayer, pained by the experiences he went all this time. I am so sorry for what happened to you, she said, mournfully. You've lost so much so in your life. I cannot imagine the pain you've went through, all this time. But please know that you do not have to stand alone in this battle. The realms beyond are grateful for your actions, but let us stand with you. You need not walk this road alone, please. The Slayer's gaze no longer held of anger, but remorse. He merely shook his head in decline. He expressed little, but showed enough. His attention turned to Teclis, who seemed guilt-ridden by all that happened. Has he arrived? Hayden asked. Indeed. I'm here to collect you. A handmaiden had relayed a message to me to find you here. We'll be disembarking shortly. Any words before we go? Almost, Hayden replied. Doomslayer instinctively turned towards the Everqueen. I am sorry that our conversation ended on a sour note, Everqueen. We will to continue this another time, I'm afraid. But understand that he prioritizes the safety for all. And he will stop at nothing to destroy the roots of all evil. Whether it be chaos or hell themselves. Then do what you must, Slayer, Alarielle parted. Doomslayer nodded and turned to Teclis, who waited expectantly. Tyrion was about to protest, but the Everqueen placed on his shoulder, stopping him from further confrontation. I'm sorry, Alarielle, Teclis said with remorse, before magically teleporting alongside Doomslayer. The two then vanished in a flash of light, leaving Alarielle, Tyrion, their daughter and the handmaidens in the gardens. Alarielle dismissed her handmaidens. Mother, are you okay? Eleuthera asked out of concern. Alarielle smiled faintly. I am all right, Ali, she reassured. Could you leave us alone for a bit, my dear? I need to speak with Tyrion. Yes, Mother. Eleuthera left the two, albeit reluctantly. Tyrion pulled out a cloth and began wiping away blood and tears off her face. I should have stopped him the moment he appeared in Teclis' library, Tyrion remarked. His scowl growing worse by the minute. Alarielle was displeased to hear those words. He stopped his hand and laid hers on his cheek. You shan't, Tyrion, Alarielle protested. He may seem brutish, but he has a noble heart. The things I saw in his mind, my heart hurts for him. Not you too, Tyrion said in defeat. What do you both see in him? I cannot tangle myself with more of this nonsense. I told you already, it was my decision to reach into the Slayer's memories, and that is my mistake alone, Alarielle replied. I too carry the burdens of the world each day. Finneber's passing deeply troubles me as well, as does Ali, but I believe he made the right choice to bring him here. He is the change that this world needs. And yet, wherever I come across him, it seems like he's conveniently causing a scene. It's ridiculous that Teclis drags him around like some pet he required, Tyrion countered. Alarielle frowned, but moved his face towards her. Alarielle's and Tyrion's eyes connected with one another. The fire stoked inside them carried with passion and love. The prince's lip turned into a sad smile as he held her hand. You and your brother have done greatly for Ulthuan than any other prince on the island. And it will be greater if you let the Slayer partake in the safety of the world. Tyrion sighed, contemplating on her words spoken by her. You and Eleuthera are the brightest jewels that have shone in this world, Tyrion remarked. And I would fight with all my blood and steel to protect you both. As is expected of you, my sweet prince, Alarielle replied, followed by a small laughter. But know that our Ali is in safe hands. And Teclis made that decision come to fruition. Alarielle kissed him on his lips, and he returned it with the same affections as well. Unbeknownst to the two, Eleuthera hid from plain view and listened in on her birth parents' chatter. I wished things turned out differently with you and father, she said to herself. She soon disappeared, eventually returning to them at some point. Meanwhile, another assailant watched from afar. Red eyes stood out of the lush greenery. The events that unfolded were becoming more and more interesting by the minute. This knight known as Doomslayer seemed to have quite the influence and impact on the world, as the Everqueen had displayed, and it would no doubt interest her mistress back in the Silver Pinnacle. And then there were the implications that the Everchild might not be who she seems to be. Now that would be very good information to take. However, this was not enough to send back only speculation, so she had to keep an eye on them. That said, it would be also good to gather intel on the Slayer. Finished with her assessment, she returned to the darkness and disappeared, where the Queen of Lamia waited further news. Alleyway, Lothern. A flash of light later, and Doomslayer found himself in a dark alley somewhere in the city. The sound of the seaport was nearby, but the scenery was that of decrepit squalor. It was an odd change, but it was to be expected. Every city had its own slums. And every slum had its secrets. Is this where our contact is? Hayden asked, not really surprised by their new surroundings. Teclis did not look back at the Slayer. Indeed, he's nearby, Teclis answered, his tone now that of embitterment. His mood had jarred and grown distant in no part to the previous event mere moments ago. Hayden, out of character, decided to say something redundant. You're upset. Was I too obvious? Teclis snipped. Hayden took sympathy and explained further. Teclis, it was not in our intention to harm the Everqueen. She wanted to see what was in his mind. I can't say it was exactly pleasant. Of course, and because of it, I make myself look like a damn fool every convenient timing. If only I could understand you, Slayer, this whole miscommunication wouldn't be as disastrous as I would have expected, Teclis said, venomously. Although, it was more to himself than it was to the Slayer. Let's just move on, Teclis grumbled. It's all in the past now. Both men continued forward, moving around the corners and slipping through tight corridors as they made their way to the meeting spot. After what felt like 5 minutes of traveling, they found their location in the form of a 2-story building long abandoned by its previous owners. Now ramshackled and faded by the passages of time. Cracks were appearing on the walls, windows were sealed up with wooden planks, and the front door was rotting away. Still, the structure remained sturdy and was in no way ready to fall apart just yet. Teclis gestured the door to open without struggle. Both entered, and blockaded the door with whatever furniture was left as they got inside. Looking around, the place had seen better days. No signs of life existed, save for the sounds of scurrying rats. No surprise if the Ratman lived here, Doomslayer thought. Both headed towards the stairs and reached the upper floors. Several rooms for one corridor, but the biggest was the second door on the left. Plenty of space and an open view of the city from one window. Teclis took a seat from a wooden chair that looked pleasant enough to not disgust the loremaster. Doomslayer, meanwhile, taken to leaning on a wall near the closed door. He should be here any moment now. Or probably is. Who knows, Teclis said. That raised an eyebrow from the Slayer. Assuming he hasn't, Hayden started. Mind if you share some details about this particular individual? Besides the bare minimum you've given us. That much, I can entertain for the time, Teclis answered. For one, he's dead. At least, according to the rest of the Asur. Simple reason as to why I kept it a secret in the first place. Don't need the hysteria come along. That, and he was formerly a supporter of the Witch King himself. Long story short, the sundering happened and what followed was betrayal and vengeance after. He is the last of his bloodline and still is. And he vows to destroy Malekith and his cohorts to his last breath. If he means to destroy Malekith, then that would be a difficult task for us, Hayden pointed out. Yes, of that, I'm aware. I have told him about this and, obviously, he did not take it well. However, I persuaded him to stay his hand until Malekith was put on trial. He bickered about it, but mentioning the Phoenix King since it was his will was more than enough to see that the plan goes accordingly. But for now, we'll just have to wait and see. Reminds of someone with such a vendetta, Hayden lampshaded. That was an obvious jab to Doomslayer, who merely smirked underneath his helm. Suddenly, Doomslayer felt another presence, and it sat in the dark corner of the room. Quickly, he summoned the combat shotgun out of thin air and aimed it towards the corner. Teclis, meanwhile, jumped out of his seat as he had taken notice of his response. He waited for whatever sat there and kept his finger on the trigger. No need for violence, a voice calmly called out. I'm not the enemy you seek. Out of the corner, came another elf. His armor had a silvery glimmer to it. Ornate with gold trimmings and heraldries of a crescent moon, the figure had a blue hood connected to a cape over his head. Conveniently, he pulled it off his head to reveal atypical features not seen on many other Asur. Namely, his hair. Instead of the commonly golden and fair-colored kind, this one had darker, raven-colored hair in contrast. His features were noticeably sharper and pale in complexion, almost ghostly in appearance. Seeing this individual in person, it could only mean one thing. Lore Master, if you can do the honors, their contacts suggested. Teclis slightly fumbled but naturally composed himself. Alright. Doomslayer and Dr. Hayden, I would like you to meet Alephanar, the Shadow King. In the flesh, Aleph added. Doomslayer lowered his gun and eventually had it disappear from his hand. Apologize for the deception, Aleph said. I had to know for certain if I can trust you as Teclis does. And now, what does your gut say? Hayden asked. It gave an amusing response from the Shadow King. My gut tells me that you are hiding plenty of surprises. And if anything, that gun of yours proved enough to dispel my reservations, Aleph replied. Doomslayer only shrugged, while Teclis sighed in relief. I take it you have considered the plan, Anar asked Teclis. I have, Lore Master, Aleph answered. Despite my issues with bringing Malekith to Ulthuan, I have decided to agree to the terms, if only to fulfill the king's wishes. Teclis was relieved to hear the good news. Aleph turned back to the Slayer. Although, seeing you turned the prince's heads with quite an impression was rather amusing. And receiving invitation from the Everqueen and Everchild is an impressive honor. Doomslayer tilted his head up a bit in surprise by the observations. So you were spying on us, then, Hayden asked. Though, not quite surprised by such. Indeed, Aleph answered, hiding nothing in his honesty. The way Teclis wrote about you, I was skeptical. But after visiting the court, I can tell that you're a warrior itching for a fight. And if your feats are to go by, I'm certain the Drachii won't be much a problem for you. Considering the enemies we've encountered, I'd say he'll cut through them like a hot knife through butter, Hayden remarked, before asking directly to Teclis in turn. Teclis, were you aware of him spying on us back at the court? Only after he informed me, yes, Teclis admitted. But I had a feeling he would be there. Just hidden from the rest of us. Don't forget that I am dead, Aleph added. Yes, that too, Teclis agreed. But since that's out of the way, I think you'll enjoy the next stage of this plan. Doomslayer, despite his helmet getting in the way, smiled visibly in rejoice. Teclis soon pulled out a map and gestured another of his magical display. This time the map floated and unraveled to reveal map of the world. And much to both Hayden's and Doomslayer's surprise, it was not unlike the geography of Earth. This is another version of our world, Hayden pointed out, much to the surprise of both Asur as well. Curious, Teclis replied, his eyes lit up with astonishment. Then perhaps we are connected in some ways. But we can discuss that for another time. Teclis began walking towards the map. This is where we are. Ulthuan, he said, pointing to the home of the Asur, before moving towards what is essentially this world's version of North America. Specifically, Canada. And right there is Nagaroth. Home to the Drachii and the Witch King himself. And standing between them and the Asur is Nagarythe. My people, Aleph interrupted. You are correct, Anar. And that will soon be settled once we bring Malekith before the court, Teclis added. The Lore Master looked directly at Doomslayer. Is there any questions you would like to ask, Dr. Hayden? None that could end in less than 2 minutes, I'm afraid, Hayden answered. Though with the map provided, this will indeed help us coordinate our next destinations in the future. And soon after, a beep from Doomslayer's armor sent an important notification for him. And would you look at that? It seems our base has finally arrived. Base? Teclis asked, both surprised and confused by Hayden's meaning. Our fortress has reached its destination. Meaning that our means of traveling to our headquarters and retrieving supplies is now in full operation. We are prepared more than ever. That's excellent news, Teclis replied with an uplifting tone. Though, where is it exactly? I doubt the Asur will take lightly to its sudden appearance. No need to panic. It's above us, Hayden simply answered. Both Asur's eyes widened in surprise. Why you mean? It's above this world's atmosphere. Meaning beyond its skies. Teclis was speechless and couldn't process the thought of a fortress way above the skies. I would like to see this fortress, one day. Another time, perhaps, Hayden replied. But for now, I'm scanning the entirety of this world. Meaning, Aleph asked, raising an eyebrow. Think of it as creating a map, in simple terms. Except visually accurate, per se. Oh. How long will that take? Asked Teclis. Done, Hayden answered. The process is complete. Though, quite worrisome to look at if the North Pole is to go by. I believe what you're seeing is the chaos wastes, Teclis said. Though, I'm more worried that you could actually see it and not be affected by its presence. My current state and programming has made me immune to such ill effects. That, and I've seen my fair share of hellish encounters. Oh, right. The invasion of hell. How forgetful of me, Teclis admitted. Hayden continued to observe the entirety of the world, looking away from the chaos wastes and observing the other continents. Aside from the dark energy readings, much of your world is interesting. I would like to explore. Thus Hayden suddenly stopped mid-sentence, causing all three to stay on alert. Teclis, is Alphuan expecting a vessel from the northwest? Hayden asked, suddenly. Teclis looked confused by this. Northwest? But that would mean Teclis suddenly realized what he meant and grew pale from the revelation. Aleph caught on and soon turned to horror, and then anger. How far is this ship? Aleph questioned. Judging by the shape and speed, it'll most likely hit shore tonight. It's passed by Nagarite and is heading down south. Are there any coastal towns near the seas? You mean the ones in Tiranoc? A few I know, Teclis answered. We'll have to hurry. Those towns need to be evacuated. We'll need to send reinforcements. Now. I agree, Aleph followed up. I'll keep an eye on the shores. My men are standing by as we speak. They will be the first defense. Doomslayer approached Aleph and R, signaling to his willingness to join. We'll join you as well, Hayden answered, while Doomslayer pulled out a shotgun and cocked it with malicious intent. Aleph could read his expressions and agreed. Very well, you may join. I'd like to see if you're as capable as stories go. Teclis. I'll warn the guards. Might have to bring this up with my brother as well. But first, I'll take you to the shores. Don't think that you'll need an army, Hayden replied. Only one man is needed, and he's standing before you. But do what you believe is necessary. As before, Teclis had begun his transportation, and all three soon vanished into the light. Leaving from the safety of the city, and into the forthcoming battle that was about to happen.